On camera and without hesitation, 13 African nations said no to Donald Trump turning down billions of infrastructure, energy and foreign aid. But why? What did he ask for that made Africa walk away from the table? Was it really just about the money, or was it about sovereignty? Let's dig deeper into the moment Africa chose dignity over dollars. Not that Africa said no, but rather how many of them did so loudly, purposefully, and without hesitation. Was shocking. 13 nations, 13 rejections. However, these diplomats weren't your typical closed-door, carefully phrased ones. First, let's talk about South Africa. On paper, Trump's proposal was straightforward: improve trade access and agricultural incentives. However, the desire for it was unimaginable. Bricks that have been abandoned. To put it simply, the United States offered Traoré a handshake in exchange for giving up its position in an increasingly anti-Western economic bloc. Even worse, Trump's administration fueled the fires by promoting the relocation of white South African farmers to America and making accusations of white genocide. President Cyril Ramaphosa found this to be more than just disrespectful. It was an attempt to drawing South Africa into the cultural conflicts in America, racialize foreign policy, and destabilize domestic politics. Instead of just turning down the offer, he took it as motivation to strengthen his ties with Russia and China. Ghana followed. Us officials probably expected thanks when they brought a $500 million proposal for military support to rather they were met with distrust. The agreement contained clauses exempting American servicemen from local rules and granting U.S. troops longer access to Ghanaian facilities. The catch: Ghana's monitoring would be minimal at home. The backlash came quickly. Opposition parties, organized citizens demonstrated, and Ghana's President Suckley withdrew. Instead of just saying no, Ghana made a U-turn and accelerated bilateral talks with China, Russia, and Turkey. Perhaps the most blatant insult masquerading as diplomacy was Nigeria's case. Significant investments in the oil industry were made available by the Trump administration. However, a request for a 51% controlling interest in important extraction zones was concealed in the documentation. The message was very obvious: America desired to possess the jewel in Nigeria's crown. It was a red line for a nation whose identity is closely linked to its oil sovereignty. Negotiations were abandoned by the Nigerian administration. Chinese oil companies obtained Niger Delta exploration licenses in the same month. Legal surrender was an additional dimension to Kenya's story. A phrase in a $3.6 billion infrastructure proposal startled Nairobi. Arbitration would take place in American courts, not in neutral territory like Kenya. In the event of a dispute, the agreement essentially granted Washington ultimate legal control over a Kenyan projects located on Kenyan territory. Kenya turned down the offer out of survival and resentment. They negotiated a comparable infrastructure agreement with Beijing a few days later, but without the formal colonization. Tanzania came next. The Trump administration believed that urgency would force the government to accept their offers of medical infrastructure and COVID-19 vaccines. The terms, however, were terrifying: lack of regard for Tanzanian health regulations, unclear side effects, and opaque trial data. It was an appeal for unquestioning faith. Rather, the late President John Magufuli took a more gradual but independent route, looking to China and India for medical collaborations that provided paperwork, supervision, and respect. The connections between these cases were not coincidental. A pattern held them together. Money, infrastructure, and security were all provided to each nation, but at a price that targeted their laws, resources, or political connections. And that trend raises a more significant query, one that is far riskier than any contract provision. What if the transactions weren't the only thing? What if the man was presenting them? Let's examine how Trump himself ended up being the cause of these closures. Donald Trump was the gunpowder. If the conditions of the agreements were the trigger every time an offer was turned down, there was an increasing unease with the man, as well as the fine print. Trump did more than undervalue Africa. He misinterpreted it. Additionally, Trump's entire diplomatic strategy was incredibly transactional, almost theatrical. He viewed press conferences as sales pitches, summits as campaign rallies, and collaborations as one-sided talks. His use of their presidents' first names during news conferences caught the attention of African officials. How he contradicted or interrupted them in the middle of their sentences, and how he strengthened his America First image by using their photo opportunities. Even ceremonial conduct turned into a warning sign when he boasted about the achievements of his administration at a UN speech in 2018. World leaders, especially African delegates, was seen on video chuckling. It was not staged, it was disbelief on its own. Everything was said in that instant. He was not in the room, it was observing him. Trump was more than just unpredictable. To many African leaders, he posed a strategic threat by sending envoys with ambiguous designations, making declarations before consultations, and treating sovereign governments like junior partners. His administration frequently broke protocol at one point. He proposed to take Sudan from the list of insurgents only if it acknowledged Israel by a certain date. It seemed less like diplomacy and more like a gang show to African eyes. After that, there was stillness. Trump stayed silent or preoccupied during significant crises that affected African countries such as the floods in Mozambique, the protests in Nigeria, and the DRC's reaction to the Ebola outbreak. Unless these occurrences bolstered a U.S. narrative, his government hardly ever acknowledged them. There was a noticeable lack of empathy there. His booming endorsements contrasted with that stillness, his frequent support of authoritarian regimes, his jokes about serving more than 2 terms in power, and his once considered purchase of Greenland raised doubts about his entire perspective on sovereignty. Trump's actions were more than just disrespectful to African nations that had waged protracted wars for independence, it was triggering. It reminded us of the stranger with wealth and influence who demands submission. Therefore, the issue of how much our dignity would be sacrificed lingered even when his administration arrived with promises of aid, roads, or security. Africa's message was nuanced yet incisive. You can't invest on Friday and criticize us on Monday. You cannot demand handshakes in meetings while disparaging us in speeches. Respect doesn't go back in time. Furthermore, diplomacy is not a show, and the outcome not only did Trump's diplomacy harm his business dealings, it aided in bringing African leaders together around a common instinct. There has to be a change in this relationship. The continent was prepared to look elsewhere because the confidence had been betrayed because of character, not merely because of contracts. And it wasn't only feelings that changed, there were actual geopolitical repercussions. The question then becomes, what new relationships emerged in the shadows, and where did Africa turn after the U.S. doors closed? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comment section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. The pivot started as soon as the faith was lost. As the third year of Donald Trump's presidency drew near, African leaders were doing more than simply turning down offers. They were taking their place with fresh players, mock with nothing. Other powers moved methodically and silently as Trump insulted, demanded, and dictated, and the fastest moving country was China. Beijing realized what Trump failed to do. Silence frequently speaks louder than insults, and respect is free. Chinese representatives spread out over the continent without much fanfare, sponsoring projects, attending summits, and making deals without using degrading language. China presented aid as business, in contrast to the Trump administration, which presented it as rescue. No hero complex, no superiority, and morals early. Ports, roads, trains, and returns. That tone was important in Donald Trump's Africa policy remained ambiguous as Beijing increased its infrastructure spending. Chinese tech companies took the place of U.S. proposals that were put on hold in Zambia. Additionally, China entered Ethiopia with satellite and surveillance agreements when the United States withdrew due to political upheaval. However, China was not the only factor in this. It dealt with Bryce and the new ideology they stood for. Bryce proposed cooperation with terms negotiated on an equal basis, whereas Washington offered deals with demands. India started promoting it, and pharmaceutical agreements in East Africa, Mali, Guinea, and Sudan were visited by Russian mining and energy specialists in Lusif, Africa. Brazil even resumed diplomatic relations, reviving agricultural and cultural contacts. Africa wasn't desperate enough to choose the East. It was a deliberate choice because these new partnerships went beyond economics. They served as a metaphor. They signaled a break with the post-Cold War worldview in which Africa was viewed as a Western geopolitical chess piece. Africa was now selecting its partners, and the roles had been reversed. A void was left by Trump's collapse, but it wasn't there for long. Chinese-built embassies, stadiums, clinics, and schools pap at the skylines of African capitals, while American embassies baffled diplomatic lethargy. Russia and India provided medical consultants and supplies as Trump slashed financing for the pandemic. The balance was shifting. Even in culture, the number of African students attending Turkish and Chinese institutions is rising. Indian developers worked with local tech clusters. Additionally, more African media outlets started covering the BRICS meeting with the same vigor they had previously only used for briefings in Washington. There was no anti-American sentiment here. Post-Americanism was the term, a silent but firm departure from one-sided reliance, and Trump in a way make it simpler. As univilized diplomacy made the choices appear appealing as well as feasible. He made BRICS appear like the grown-up in the room by rejecting multilateralism, global health programs, and climate treaties. Stone by stone, the East constructed new bridges while the United States destroyed others. It's crucial to remember the pressure was not the reason behind the BRICS move. The invitation was the source. No one ordered African countries to take sides. They only observed where they were treated with respect. And where they weren't, therefore Trump's presidency wasn't the only thing that ended when his tenure was over. It was a time period America's default influence in Africa was over. An ecosystem of choices, adaptability and leverage has taken its place, but there was more to this new alignment, a lesson. What else have African countries silently accepted for too long? If a superpower can lose favor so easily, were there any more one-sided relationships? Which trends were now too clear to overlook? Trump was no longer the focus. It had to do with a system. Africa was now prepared to take on that system head-on. Trump wasn't the actual break. History was involved. Many in the West believed it was ideological when African nations started to reject the Trump administration's plans and realign with BRICS, even opportunistic perhaps, but they failed to see the bigger picture. These choices weren't merely political ones. They were adjustments to the past, because there was an old pain hidden behind every rejection letter. Chile handshake and newly constructed Chinese-funded roadway. Africa does not forget. It recalls the scramble in which no African was present at the table as European powers cut it up like a cake. It recalls stolen names, fictitious borders, and imposed treaties. It honors missionaries who brought Bibles and took gold with them. It also recalls what happened afterward. NF demurs, debt traps, puppet governments and help that always had a catch. Follow the so-called independence. That legacy was not created by Trump. All he did was remind Africa that it was still alive. It wasn't new for his administration to publicly criticize leaders, demand control over national resources, or offer bargains based on U.S. court decisions. It was well known. It had Leopold's voice, similar to Rhodes' the British East India Company, for example. These were hardly the first sounds heard in Africa. They just spoke with American accents this time. Bad agreements were not the only reason Trump was rejected. It has to do with the mental reluctance to revisit the past. Think about the symbolism under the guise of help or stabilization. Trump's team pitched financing deals that would legally bind countries to U.S. control. This was a déjà vu moment for African governments in the past. Colonial officers used these kinds of contracts to manipulate trade, impose labor, and steal land. Even worse, the cultural messaging continued to be patronizing. African leaders observe how Western media presented their rejections as reckless or short-sighted rather than as displays of sovereignty. Saying no was viewed as an error in itself, as if being independent was still a stage rather than a planned state. And there is a price for this haughtiness. Like in the past, the West retaliated more when Africa pushed back. Ghana was subject to travel restrictions after turning down Trump's promises. Tariffs were imposed on South Africa. US corporations secretly canceled contracts with Nigeria. It wasn't as loud as previously, but the punishment came swiftly. However, a change had occurred. Africa did not flinch this time because it had choices now. More significantly, it was confident new investment terms were being dictated by the same continent that had previously been obliged to plead for debt relief. The same nations that had previously served as test markets for Western goods were now engaged in equal opportunity bilateral trade negotiations with China, India, and Brazil. Trump was only a catalyst. The larger reaction was to the Western worldview that he represented, which continues to see African dignity as negotiable and African sovereignty as conditional. Because of this, the change cannot be reversed, since it isn't a trend, it's a reckoning. Africa is no longer attempting to convince the West of its value. It is now requesting an explanation from the West as to why is even worthy of trust, and that inquiry leads us to the here and now. What happens if trust has been destroyed and history has returned? Can Africa afford to remain in this impasse indefinitely? All is a new foundation already being built. Something extraordinary occurred. Once the ghosts of the past were faced, Africa gave up plain defense. The Trump-era rejections were the beginning of a doctrine M, only a symbolic rejection of a leader. African countries quietly started creating something new without making big announcements or using eye-catching phrases. A foreign strategy based on trust and value rather than fear of exclusion. No more taking unfair deals in silence, no more condescending performative handshakes. They appeared on the international scene during the begging era. The continent had been conditioned to think in terms of survival and aid for decades. The West promised obedience in return for growth. Lectures were included with loans. Huts in hand, they attended summits. But after Trump, African leaders realized they could turn down offers that included threats and yet walk away. And there was no turning back. Once that line was crossed, refusing became a tactic. Capitals like Addis Ababa and Acura started creating unique investment models, shopping them globally on African terms, rather than waiting for agreements to come in from Washington. Land, labor, and local ownership protection clauses are now included in public infrastructure tenders. Transparency of data was required by medical agreements. Mutual legal accountability is a prerequisite for military alliances. The world took note. China adjusted. Russia did what it was told in recent policy documents. The EU even started to change its tone by using more accommodative language in former Communes protests, embassy attacks, and base closures have occurred against France, Africa's most powerful post-colonial power, as residents call for the complete removal of French influence. African first diplomacy is not an isolationist philosophy. Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.